I am Eleanor, and every day I witness the silent suffering of elderly people who enter the hospital expecting care but are treated with disregard simply because they don't have financial means. I see it, I feel it, and I am moved by this reality. They are not seen as people, but as numbers. Today, I will tell the story of one of these elderly individuals, someone who, like so many others, has been forgotten by the system, but whose pain cannot be ignored. The fluorescent hum of a major city hospital should promise succor, yet within its sterile corridors, a silent judgment was passed. A single, desperate knock at the heavy security door was met not with assistance, but with the cold steel of prejudice. What happens when the gatekeepers of care see only what they expect to see? This is the story of an unseen barrier erected against suffering, a dismissal based on threadbare cloth rather than dire need. It began with a turning away, an administrative snub that echoed further inside the system. The air grew colder, and an innocent life began its irreversible countdown. Entirely preventable, entirely unforgivable. The October chill of October 12, 2023 bit deep, a raw, unforgiving cold that seemed to seep right through the concrete and glass of St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital. I was waiting in the near-empty space just beyond the main automatic doors, caught in that purgatorial stretch of the outer hospital corridor, known chillingly by the staff as the gray zone. It was dimly lit, perpetually smelling faintly of industrial cleaner and old anxiety, far enough from the central A&E hub that one felt truly isolated, yet close enough to hear the distant, rhythmic squeal of trolley wheels, the sound of urgency that wasn't meant for you. He approached the security checkpoint with immense effort, clearly fighting an internal battle more savage than the external one he was about to face. Standing sentinel was Sergeant Marcus Thorne, 45 years old, an imposing figure in his impeccably dressed security uniform. Thorne possessed sharp, piercing blue eyes that seemed to sweep over Arthur Davies with immediate, cold appraisal, bypassing the obvious physical distress. "Stop there, sir." Thorne's voice cut across the ambient hospital noise, authoritative and utterly devoid of warmth. He held up a hand, an invisible but solid barrier. Arthur Davies attempted a breathy explanation, perhaps managed a choked syllable about his heart, but Thorne wasn't listening to words. He was reading clothes. "Emergency entrance procedures are clearly posted. You need to present documentation at the main desk first. And I'll need you to step back from the immediate entranceway." Thorne did not move to assist. He merely blocked passage, his stance rigid, embodying a protocol that seemed entirely disconnected from the man collapsing before him. The worn tweed overcoat seemed to be the entire basis for the judgment. Thorne's eyes flickered down, then back up, dismissing the visible suffering. To him, Arthur Davies was not a patient. He was an obstruction, someone whose presentation suggested he might cause administrative trouble, or perhaps more damningly in Thorne's narrow view, look unsightly near the polished marble of the main lobby. The security access fob clipped to Thorne's belt seemed to gleam mockingly. The key to a sanctuary Arthur Davies was being denied. From my vantage point in the gray zone, I could only watch the theater of cold negligence unfold. Abigail Shaw, 55 years old, a woman I'd just met while queuing near the entrance, stood beside me. Her slightly frayed raincoat felt suddenly significant. She was an ordinary person, unvarnished by institutional veneer, and she saw exactly what I saw. Her expression was one of dawning horror. "Look at him, Sergeant," Abigail whispered hoarsely, her voice tight with suppressed outrage. "The man is ill. He can barely stand." Sergeant Thorne barely spared her a glance. "Ma'am, this is a secured area. I have directives regarding immediate entry protocols. If he requires A&E, he must queue like everyone else at the triage entrance, not loiter here." He used the word loiter with venom, implying the old man was choosing this spot for sport rather than necessity. Arthur Davies swayed violently, his hand slipping from his chest to grip the cold tiled wall for support. He made a small, pathetic sound, a grunt of pure agony. It was the sound of dignity dissolving into desperation. Inside the sterile, brightly lit area just beyond the security line, I could glimpse the staff moving with practiced, detached efficiency. I saw a junior doctor, Dr. Eleanor Vance, 38 years old, moving quickly in her neat professional scrubs, her tired but focused eyes fixed on a clipboard, the emergency triage clipboard that governed life and death in this place. She was moments away from being engaged with the next incoming, seemingly more suitable case. She did not look toward the entrance where the silent drama was unfolding. The institutional blindness was staggering. They were conditioned to process paperwork, to see patients through the lens of insurance codes and administrative efficiency, not through the raw lens of human biology failing rapidly. Sergeant Thorne produced his security access fob, tapping it against a reader near the main door, establishing his dominance over the threshold. "Sir, I must ask you to leave the immediate vicinity or I will have to escalate this to removal." Arthur Davis tried one last futile gesture, a weak lift of his hand towards the glass doors. He was pleading not for luxury, but for basic biological necessity. But the plea was invisible to the system. He turned defeated, his body already seeming to give way under the weight of his illness and the weight of societal rejection. He staggered backward, away from the imposing architecture, away from the promise of aid, back toward the harsh exposure of the gray zone. It was then, witnessing the immediate effect of that administrative cruelty, that the injustice became physically sickening. Thorne had effectively signed his death warrant with a curt dismissal based on the quality of his coat. Abigail Shaw broke away from me, unable to bear the passivity any longer. She rushed towards Arthur Davis just as he collapsed against a low partition wall in the dimmer lighting of the outer corridor. "Help! Someone call for a doctor! He's collapsed!" Abigail's cry was raw, piercing the professional hum of the hospital, but it felt strangely muffled, absorbed by the thick, indifferent walls. The scene shifted rapidly. The proximity of the collapse finally triggered a response, but it was too late. Dr. Vance, perhaps alerted by the sudden commotion Abigail caused, finally looked up, her focused eyes catching the scene. She saw the elderly man on the floor, and she saw Sergeant Thorne, already retreating slightly, his posture conveying, not my jurisdiction now. Vance rushed out, her professional speed a sudden sharp contrast to the previous glacial pace of entry. I watched her kneel beside Arthur Davis. Her hands, trained and quick, began checking for a pulse, her face hardening with professional alarm. "What happened? Why wasn't he triaged immediately?" Vance demanded, her voice sharp now, cutting through the haze of procedure. Abigail Shaw, gasping for breath, pointed back towards the security desk, her finger trembling. "The guard, he wouldn't let him in, said his coat was the wrong sort of entrance." Vance worked furiously, administering chest compressions, her training kicking in against the chaos caused by human prejudice. But the delay, the crucial, fatal minutes spent arguing about attire rather than treating acute cardiac symptoms, had already ensured the worst. The silence that fell after her final, sharp gasp of effort was heavier than any sound. Arthur Davis was gone. Later, after the official chaos had subsided, after the police tape was a stark yellow ribbon against the gray floor of the gray zone, I saw Dr. Vance again. She was leaning against a wall near the triage station, not looking at her emergency triage clipboard, but staring blankly toward the entrance where Thorne still stood guard. Her exhaustion was profound, but now it was layered with something else, the bitter taste of knowing. She had been constrained, a cog in a machine that prized appearance over life, yet she carried the burden of the failure. She understood, with a chilling clarity that would haunt her career, that Arthur Davis hadn't died because the hospital lacked the skill to save him. He died because Sergeant Thorne, fueled by some warped sense of hierarchical order and judging a man by his threadbare tweed, had blocked the door until it was too late. It was a systemic failure of empathy, brutally executed by a man in uniform, culminating in the irreversible loss of an innocent life within the supposedly sanctified walls of St. Jude's. The silence where Arthur Davis's life had been was deafening proof of the price paid for institutional snobbery. The harsh fluorescent lighting of St. Jude's seemed to hum with a perverse energy, an energy dedicated to procedure rather than cure. Having witnessed the shocking death of Arthur, I found myself frozen in the periphery of the ensuing clinical chaos. Eleanor, the junior doctor, was now surrounded by more senior staff, their faces grim as they performed procedural checks that, even in their urgency, felt secondary to the sheer, avoidable tragedy of the situation. They were attending to the body, but the truth hung heavy in the air. The true affliction had been administered hours earlier, not by a bacterium or a faulty organ, but by a rigid adherence to superficial judgment at the entrance. I watched Eleanor, her brow furrowed deeply, her usual quiet dedication now overlaid with a terrifying strain. She had seen countless deaths, but this one was different. It was contaminated by clear, demonstrable negligence. When the immediate flurry subsided, she approached the security hub, ignoring the presence of Marcus, who was now stiffly readjusting his collar, trying to project an air of professional detachment that was utterly unconvincing. Marcus, Eleanor's voice was low, tight, carrying the controlled fury of someone who operates within strict boundaries, but is finally witnessing those boundaries collapse under moral weight. I need the log from the past hour, specifically the recording of your interaction with Mr. Davies. Marcus shifted his weight, his sharp eyes darting towards the monitors displaying muted images of the hospital grounds. The security access fob on his belt seemed to catch the light like a cold, hard promise of obstruction. Dr. Vance, with respect, my actions were compliant with standing directives regarding A&E access flow. The individual appeared disorderly and failed to present at the correct entry point. Disorderly? Eleanor scoffed, the sound dry and brittle. He was clutching his chest, Marcus. I've seen your logbooks before. I know how you categorize people who look like they've slept rough or who wear a worn tweed overcoat. You didn't see a potential cardiac arrest. You saw a paperwork inconvenience. This was the core of the confrontation, the clash between the sworn duty of a healer and the self-imposed class-based mandate of a guard. The ambient noise of the hospital seemed to fade as the accusation hung between them. Just then, Abigail, who had been quietly giving a brief statement to a passing police officer, moved closer. She looked utterly drained, the shock etching deeper lines around her eyes. She stepped up beside Eleanor, providing an unintended but crucial reinforcement. "He was begging, Doctor," Abigail stated, her voice steady now, fueled by righteous indignation. "I saw the way Marcus looked at that coat. It was like judging a man's worth by the shine on his shoes. Arthur was clearly in agony. If I hadn't caused a scene, would anyone even have noticed until the body was cold?" Marcus turned fully towards them, his authoritarian facade beginning to crack under the combined pressure of direct challenge. "This is an internal matter, not to be discussed with members of the public. My job is to maintain security and order. The triage system exists for a reason." "The triage system relies on timely access, Marcus," Eleanor retorted, moving closer to him until they were separated by little more than the sterile desk surface. "When a failure point exists at the threshold, the very first point of contact, the entire system fails. You created that delay. You placed protocol above a human being actively dying in front of you. That coat cost you 0 seconds of consideration, but it cost Arthur his life." The intensity of Eleanor's gaze seemed to penetrate Marcus's composure. He knew, perhaps only dimly at first, that this time the dismissal felt different. Usually, such complaints were filed away, perhaps resulting in a light reprimand about customer service. But this time, a life was lost directly adjacent of his post. The institutional blindness that permitted his actions was now laid bare in the cold light of fatality. He glanced down at the security access fob hanging from his belt, the symbol of his arbitrary power. For a brief, horrifying instant, he seemed to see the tweed coat, the color of Arthur's face, not on the monitors, but reflected in the cold metal. He blinked, pulling his composure back around him like armor. "I will cooperate with the internal review," Marcus managed, his voice strained, devoid of its earlier sharp authority. "But I maintain my adherence to protocol." It was a weak defense, the last desperate clutch of a man refusing to accept personal culpability for systemic error. Eleanor turned away, shaking her head slowly. The police were now formally documenting the scene. The finality of Arthur's stillness was an accusation far more potent than any shouted word. She realized that the true horror wasn't just the death, but the knowledge that somewhere, in another part of the city, another person fitting Arthur's description, poor, elderly, perhaps ill-dressed, was facing the same initial barrier, the same indifferent scrutiny, and might soon face the same consequence. The tragedy was not a single point of failure, but a continuous thread woven into the fabric of the hospital's reception. I walked away then, back into the cold air, leaving Eleanor trapped in the aftermath, the embodiment of conscientious effort defeated by bureaucratic callousness. The grand, imposing structure of St. Jude's felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully constructed mausoleum, where the dignity of the vulnerable was exchanged for the seamless operation of the machine. The death of Arthur was a stain that no amount of industrial cleaning fluid in the gray zone could ever scrub away. The silence of his passing spoke louder than any medical report, a chilling testament to the deadly nature of judgmental inattention in a place dedicated to saving life. His worn tweed overcoat, now just an item of evidence, rested silently where he fell, a grim marker of a life lost to the unforgivable negligence of perceived status. The subsequent days at St. Jude's were thick with a suffocating silence, the kind that follows a sudden, violent storm. Arthur's death was now a fixed point, an unavoidable scar on the hospital's reputation, however much the administration attempted to smooth the edges with procedural jargon. I saw Eleanor again near the nurses' station on the 3rd floor, not treating patients, but sitting alone, staring vacantly at a wall where a motivational poster about patient-centric care hung askew. She looked hollowed out, the fatigue beneath her eyes having morphed into a permanent shadow. When she noticed me observing her, she offered a faint, humorless smile. "It's the quiets that's the worst," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the distant muffled sounds of the emergency department. "When the police leave, when the paperwork settles, and you are left with only the sound of the monitors humming, knowing one of those beeps was silenced unnecessarily." I approached cautiously, understanding that proximity to her grief was almost an act of complicity. "And Marcus?" Eleanor sighed, running a hand through her short, neat hair, a gesture of deep frustration. "Marcus is on administrative leave. They are calling it a procedural review, but we both know what that means. A slap on the wrist, maybe a sensitivity course, and he will be back at the entrance in 6 weeks, judging the next person by the state of their shoes." This systemic inertia, the refusal of the institution to truly correct its foundational bias, was perhaps the most infuriating aspect. The negligence wasn't a spontaneous act. It was the predictable outcome of an environment that implicitly endorsed looking down upon the less fortunate. "Did you look at the records, Eleanor? The ones you demanded from him?" I asked. 8 minutes of delay for acute symptoms," I murmured, feeling a fresh wave of nausea. 8 minutes when a heart attack is actively progressing. "Exactly," Eleanor confirmed, her voice tightening with raw anger. "But the crucial part, the part that makes my blood run cold, is what happened next. Abigail had caused a small commotion trying to intervene, drawing attention. Marcus, clearly agitated by the public disruption, finally relented, not out of duty, but to regain control of the situation. He walked Arthur, physically walked him, mind you, not towards triage, but towards the gray zone. This detail was new, a fresh layer of betrayal. The gray zone was the anteroom of the hospital, a neglected, poorly heated corridor intended for overflow or deliveries, miles away from the immediate care of the A&E entrance. Why the gray zone? I pressed. Because he didn't want the visual contamination near the main intake, Eleanor explained, her gaze now sharp and focused, detailing the mechanics of the cruelty. He wanted the problem out of sight. He ushered Arthur over there, telling him to wait for a porter, and then he returned to his post. Arthur was left alone, shivering, likely still trying to catch his breath, in a place where no staff member would naturally walk past for at least another half hour, perhaps more. This was the culmination, the moment where perceived slight turned lethal. It wasn't just barring entry, it was active misdirection into a zone of neglect. Did Abigail follow him? She tried, Eleanor admitted, shaking her head sadly, but she was being detained by a junior admin officer for causing a disturbance. She looked back just as Marcus pushed Arthur toward the dark end of that corridor. She saw the worn tweed overcoat disappear into the gloom. When she finally broke away, maybe 15 minutes later, Arthur was already slumped against the cold wall. Too late. The paramedics confirmed that the critical intervention window had closed by the time the first passerby found him and raised the alarm. The full horror of Marcus's actions settled heavily upon us. His desire to maintain a superficial veneer of order, a clean entrance free of the disheveled poor, had actively placed Arthur in a forgotten corner to expire. It was malice disguised as protocol, I stated, the words tasting like ash. Eleanor leaned back, exhaustion winning over indignation for a moment. It was worse than malice. Malice suggests intent to harm. This was total, arrogant indifference. Marcus didn't hate Arthur. He simply didn't see him as deserving of immediate notice. Arthur's appearance dictated his value in that security officer's eyes, and that judgment, enacted through the simple act of pointing him toward the gray zone, was a death sentence. We stood in silence for a moment, two witnesses to an avoidable catastrophe that would likely never make the headlines, buried instead in internal review documents marked confidential. The imposing structure of St. Jude's seemed to loom over us, its bright lights mocking the darkness Arthur had been consigned to just outside its gleaming doors. I looked towards the security hub. Marcus was gone, but the monitors still flickered, recording everything, and yet understanding nothing. I thought of the security access fob, that small piece of plastic that held so much arbitrary power over who deserved urgent care and who deserved to wait in the cold for an indeterminate amount of time. That fob represented the gatekeeper role, admitting the polished, excluding the vulnerable. The investigation would conclude eventually. Eleanor would return to her demanding shifts, carrying this tragedy like an invisible weight. And the system, I feared, would learn nothing of true value. It would learn how to better cover its tracks, how to ensure that the next person turned away was taken slightly further from the main thoroughfare, perhaps towards a less visible maintenance staircase instead of the gray zone. Arthur Davies deserved dignity and timely medical intervention. He received neither. His death, caused by a uniform refusing passage based on the threadbare quality of his clothing, was the perfect, damning indictment of a society that prioritizes perception over life itself. There was no ambiguity here, only the stark, horrifying clarity of neglect culminating in absolute, irreversible loss. The image of that worn tweed overcoat discarded against the institutional sterility of the hospital wall was burned into my memory, the final, silent testament to a life extinguished by indifference. Smash that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed this one.